I've always prided myself on being the kind of wife other women envied. When Walter got diagnosed with cancer 3 years ago, I was right there beside him through every chemo session, every sleepless night, every moment when he thought he might not make it. Before that, when we both lost our jobs during that awful recession period, I held us together. When my mother died, I grieved quietly, so Walter wouldn't have to deal with my emotional mess on top of everything else. 5 years of marriage, and I'd been nothing short of devoted. So when people ask me how everything fell apart, I want them to understand that context first. I wasn't some cheating wife who just decided to blow up her marriage for fun. I was exhausted. I was unappreciated. And I was slowly disappearing into the background of my own life, while Walter organized his pill dispensers and checked his temperature twice a day, and treated our home like a medical facility instead of a place where two people were supposed to be in love. The thing about surviving cancer is that it changes you, and not always in the inspiring ways people talk about. Walter became obsessed with his health, which I understood, but he also became obsessed with control. Everything had to be scheduled, planned, documented. Our medicine cabinet looked like a pharmacy, with every bottle lined up by expiration date and labels facing forward. He had spreadsheets for his doctor appointments, charts for his supplements, and a whole system for tracking every symptom or change he experienced. I watched the man I married disappear into this anxious, hyper-vigilant version of himself. And honestly, it was suffocating. That's how I ended up really talking to Jason for the first time. We'd worked in the same building for years, but after one of those particularly frustrating mornings where Walter spent 20 minutes explaining why we needed to reorganize our entire kitchen to optimize his new dietary requirements, I found myself in the break room just venting to whoever would listen. Jason was there, making coffee, and he actually listened. Not the way Walter listened, where I could tell he was mentally planning his response or thinking about something else entirely, but really listened. "Sounds like you could use a break from being everyone's caretaker," he said. And something about the way he said it made me realize how long it had been since anyone had asked what I needed. It started innocently enough. Coffee conversations, then lunch meetings that ran a little long, then text messages that had nothing to do with work. Jason was funny and spontaneous and interested in me as a person, not just as Walter's wife or his personal medical assistant. When he looked at me, I felt like the woman I used to be before I became consumed with managing Walter's recovery and our household and everyone else's needs but my own. I'm not proud of what happened next, but I'm not going to pretend I didn't need it either. The first time Jason kissed me, I felt more alive than I had in months. It was selfish, yes, but I'd been selfless for so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to want something just for me. Walter was healthy now. Our finances had stabilized, and I deserved to feel desired again. I deserved to remember what it was like to be more than someone's caregiver. The affair wasn't planned. It just happened, the way these things do when you're starving for attention and someone finally offers to feed you. Jason made me laugh. He surprised me with little gifts. He sent me texts throughout the day that had nothing to do with appointments or medications or household management. When we were together, I wasn't Walter's wife or anyone's anything. I was just Rebecca, and that felt revolutionary. I told myself it was temporary, just something I needed to get out of my system so I could come back to my marriage refreshed and ready to be the wife Walter needed again. It wasn't like I was planning to leave him or destroy our life together. If anything, I thought this might save our marriage by helping me remember who I was outside of all the caregiving and crisis management that had defined the past few years. The first sign that things might get complicated came when I went for my routine checkup. I'd been having some minor symptoms, nothing dramatic, just some discomfort that could have been anything. My doctor suggested an STI panel as part of the standard workup, which seemed ridiculous since I'd been married for 5 years, but I agreed because it was easier than explaining why I thought it was unnecessary. When the results came back positive for chlamydia, my first reaction was disbelief. This wasn't supposed to happen to people like me. I wasn't some reckless teenager or someone who slept around carelessly. I was a married woman who'd made one mistake. Well, several mistakes, but with the same person, so it hardly counted as reckless behavior. The nurse was very clinical about it, explaining treatment options and partner notification requirements, but all I could think about was how to handle this without destroying everything I'd worked so hard to build with Walter. I needed time to think. Walter had been through so much with his health already, and his anxiety about medical issues was still really intense. Dropping this on him without a plan seemed cruel. Especially when I wasn't even sure how serious it was or what it meant for our marriage. The last thing he needed was to worry about his health again, particularly when this was something I could probably handle quietly and efficiently. The treatment was simple enough, just antibiotics, and I figured I'd get that started and then find a way to tell Walter that made sense. Maybe I could say I'd been feeling off and gotten tested as a precaution, then we'd both get treated just to be safe. It wasn't really lying, just managing the timing and presentation to minimize unnecessary stress for both of us. But days turned into weeks, and the right moment never seemed to come. Walter was doing so well, finally seeming more like his old self, and I couldn't bring myself to introduce this chaos into our lives. Jason assured me that these things were incredibly common and often asymptomatic, which meant Walter might not even contract it. We were being more careful now anyway, so really, the risk was minimal. I kept telling myself I'd tell Walter soon. Maybe after his next routine checkup with his oncologist, or after the work stress died down, or after we got through the holidays. There was always something that made it seem smarter to wait just a little longer. And honestly, Walter seemed happier than he'd been in months. We were getting along better, probably because I was feeling more fulfilled and less resentful about our relationship. In a weird way, my situation with Jason was actually improving my marriage. Then Walter started showing symptoms. At first, I thought maybe it was unrelated. He was always hypersensitive to any changes in his body because of the cancer history. But when he mentioned making a doctor's appointment to get checked out, I knew what was coming. My stomach dropped, but I tried to stay calm. There were still ways this could work out without everything exploding. The day Walter came home with his test results, I was in the kitchen making dinner and trying to act normal. I heard his car in the driveway and took a deep breath, reminding myself that whatever happened, we could work through it. We'd gotten through cancer and job loss and my mother's death. We could handle this too. But Walter didn't look like someone who wanted to work through anything. He slammed the papers down on the counter in front of me with this expression I'd never seen before, cold and angry and completely unlike him. "Look at the circled results," he said, and his voice was so flat and controlled that it scared me more than if he'd been yelling. I looked at the papers, playing for time while my mind raced. "What are these?" I asked, even though I obviously knew exactly what they were. "STI test results. Positive for chlamydia. Care to explain how that happened?" The accusation in his voice made me defensive immediately. After everything I'd done for this man, everything I'd sacrificed and endured, he was going to stand there and talk to me like I was some kind of criminal? "I don't believe you," I said, because honestly, the whole situation was so surreal that denial seemed reasonable. "Maybe you got it somewhere else." Walter stared at me like I'd slapped him. "Somewhere else? Rebecca, I've been with you for 5 years. Where exactly do you think I would have gotten it?" I could see him getting more upset, and I knew I needed to defuse this before it spiraled completely out of control. "Look, I read about this stuff online after my appointment," I said. Which was true, sort of. These infections can stay dormant for years. Maybe it's something from before we were together that's just showing up now. It sounded plausible even to me. STIs were complicated, and dormancy was a real thing with some infections. Walter was smart, but he wasn't a doctor, and his anxiety about health issues sometimes made him jump to worst-case scenarios. If I could get him to calm down and think rationally, we could probably get through this without destroying everything. Walter looked at me for a long moment, and I could see him processing what I'd said. Finally, his shoulders relaxed slightly. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. With everything I've been through, finding out I had another infection scared me. And I guess I needed someone to blame. He kissed my forehead, and I felt this wave of relief wash over me. We were going to be okay. Walter was reasonable and loving, and he trusted me enough to accept that sometimes medical things were just complicated and not anyone's fault. "We'll both get treated," I said, putting my arms around him. "It's probably nothing serious, and then we can put this whole thing behind us." That night, I texted Jason to let him know what had happened. "I think he actually believed it," I wrote, because honestly, I was a little impressed with how smoothly I'd handled the situation. Walter was already making appointments for both of us to get the antibiotic treatment, and he seemed more concerned about making sure we were both healthy than about assigning blame or asking uncomfortable questions. Jason was relieved, too. He'd been worried about what would happen if Walter found out about us, not because he cared about my marriage particularly, but because workplace drama was the last thing either of us needed. We agreed to be more careful going forward, maybe take a break from seeing each other until things settled down completely. For a few days, everything felt normal again. Walter was back to his usual routine of monitoring his health and organizing our medical supplies, but without the anger and suspicion that had scared me so much. We got our prescriptions filled together, and he even made jokes about how we were like an old married couple sharing medications. I started to think we'd actually gotten through the worst of it without any permanent damage to our relationship. Then I came home from work and found Walter sitting at our kitchen table with my phone in his hands. "You went through my phone?" I said, and I could hear how shrill my voice sounded, but I couldn't help it. The invasion of privacy was stunning, especially from someone who'd just been apologizing for doubting me a few days earlier. Walter looked up at me with that same cold expression from the day he'd confronted me about the test results. "I was looking for something else entirely," he said, "but I found some interesting text messages and some photos in a hidden folder that I'm pretty sure weren't meant for me." My heart was pounding, but I tried to stay calm. I deleted most of the compromising messages with Jason, and the photos weren't that explicit. Maybe I could still explain this away, or at least minimize the damage enough to save my marriage. "Whatever you think you saw," I started, but Walter held up his hand to stop me. "I also found your email," he said. "The one from 3 weeks ago with your STI test results, positive for chlamydia. 3 weeks before I got tested." The bottom fell out of my stomach. I'd completely forgotten about the email confirmation from the lab. In all my careful planning about how to handle the situation with Walter, I'd never thought about the digital trail that would show exactly when I'd known about my status. "Walter, I can explain," I said, but even as I said it, I wasn't sure how. "You knew," he said, and his voice was so quiet I had to strain to hear him. "You knew you were infected, and you kept sleeping with me anyway, for 3 weeks. "It wasn't like that," I said quickly. "I was trying to figure out how to tell you without making you panic about your health again. You know how anxious you get about medical stuff, and I thought if I could just handle it quietly." "Handle it quietly?" Walter's voice was getting louder now. "You were handling it quietly while giving me an STI?" "I was protecting you," I said, because that was true, at least partially. I didn't want you to worry unnecessarily when I wasn't even sure what it meant or how serious it was. Walter stood up from the table, and I could see him trying to control his temper. "The protection angle is interesting, Rebecca, considering you were infecting me while claiming to protect me." He had a point, but he was missing the bigger picture. "Look, I know this looks bad," I said, "but it's not what you think. Jason is just a friend from work, and things got a little complicated, but it's not some big affair or anything serious. It was just a mistake that kind of snowballed." "Jason," Walter repeated. "Your coworker, Jason." I nodded, hoping he'd understand that this wasn't about not loving him or wanting to leave him. "It just happened, Walter. I didn't plan it, and I didn't want to hurt you. That's why I was trying to handle the medical stuff quietly, so we could work through the other issues without making everything more complicated." Walter looked at me like he'd never seen me before. "You gave me an STI from your affair, lied about it, gaslit me into thinking it was somehow my fault or some dormant thing, and now you want me to believe you were protecting me?" When he put it like that, it sounded worse than it was. "I made a mistake," I said. People make mistakes, Walter. After everything we've been through together, everything I've done for you, doesn't that count for something? What you've done for me? Walter's laugh was bitter and sharp. You mean like knowingly infecting me with an STI while I trusted you completely? That's not fair, I said. I've been there for you through everything. The cancer, the job loss, all of it. I held our life together when you couldn't, and one mistake doesn't erase all of that. It wasn't one mistake, Rebecca. It was a series of deliberate choices. The affair, the unprotected sex while you knew you were infected, the lies, the gaslighting. That's not a mistake. That's a pattern. Walter walked toward the door, then turned back to look at me. I'm filing for divorce. I'd suggest you get a good lawyer. The next few weeks were a blur of legal consultations and damage control. My lawyer, Maddie, was professional, but clearly uncomfortable with the facts of my case. When I explained the timeline to her, emphasizing that the affair was brief and that I'd been trying to protect Walter from unnecessary stress about the STI, she kept asking clarifying questions that made it obvious she thought I was leaving something out. The problem, Maddie explained during one of our meetings, is that the timeline is very clear. You received positive test results and continued having unprotected sex with your husband for 3 weeks. That's going to be difficult to explain in court. I was trying to find the right way to tell him, I said. Walter has severe anxiety about health issues because of his cancer history. I was being considerate of his mental health. Maddie looked skeptical. And the affair? A mistake, I said firmly. A brief lapse in judgment that I was trying to end without destroying my marriage unnecessarily. But Walter's lawyer, Victor, was apparently much sharper than I'd given him credit for. When we finally got to court, he had everything organized in a timeline that made my choices look calculated and malicious. Judge Riley reviewed the evidence with this expression of growing disgust that made my stomach churn. The STI test dates were particularly damaging. Victor presented them like some kind of smoking gun, showing exactly when I'd received my positive results and when Walter had gotten his. He had printouts of the text messages I thought I'd deleted, including the one where I'd told Jason I think he actually believed it, after Walter had accepted my dormancy explanation. Your Honor, Victor said, the evidence shows a clear pattern of deliberate deception and reckless endangerment. Mrs. Rebecca knowingly exposed her husband to a sexually transmitted infection while conducting an extramarital affair, then systematically lied about the source and timeline when confronted. Maddie did her best to present my side, emphasizing the stress I'd been under and the complexity of the situation, but even she seemed to be going through the motions. When Judge Riley asked if I wanted to make a statement, I tried to explain about the caregiving burden and the emotional neglect and how the affair had been more about feeling appreciated than about not loving Walter. But I could tell from her expression that none of it was landing the way I'd hoped. The divorce terms were more punitive than I'd expected. We split our assets equally, which was fair enough, but Judge Riley denied my request for spousal support and ordered me to pay Walter's legal and medical fees, plus additional damages for emotional distress. The total came to nearly $60,000, which was devastating given that I'd already spent most of my savings on my own legal fees. But the financial consequences were just the beginning. Walter also filed a negligence lawsuit against me, claiming that my deliberate exposure to an STI constituted reckless endangerment. I thought it was vindictive overkill, but his lawyer argued that my actions showed such a deliberate disregard for Walter's health and safety that civil damages were warranted. When that case went to court, the judgment was even worse. The jury awarded Walter additional damages, and the local news picked up the story as an unusual case of STI-related negligence. My employer, already uncomfortable with the divorce proceedings, decided that the negative publicity reflected poorly on the organization and terminated my employment. Jason, who'd been supportive during the early stages of the legal drama, disappeared completely once the negligence lawsuit made headlines. He stopped returning my calls and started avoiding me at work. And after I got fired, I heard through mutual friends that he'd told people our relationship had been a mistake and that he never meant for things to go so far. The isolation was the hardest part. Walter had cut off all contact except through lawyers, which I understood to some extent, but I'd hoped that once the legal proceedings were over, we might be able to have a conversation about rebuilding some kind of relationship. We'd been together for 5 years, and despite everything that had happened, I still loved him. I still believed we could work through this if he'd just give us a chance. I tried calling him a few months after the divorce was finalized. I'd been in therapy, working on understanding my choices and taking responsibility for the pain I'd caused. I wanted him to know that I recognized how badly I'd handled everything, and that I was committed to being the person he'd fallen in love with originally. Walter answered on the third ring, but his voice was completely neutral. "What do you want, Rebecca?" "I just wanted to talk," I said. "To see how you're doing and maybe discuss whether we could try to repair some of the damage between us." "There's nothing to repair," he said. "I'm moving forward with my life, and I'd appreciate it if you'd respect that." "But Walter, we had 5 years together. Good years. Doesn't that mean anything to you?" "It means I learned some valuable lessons," he said. "But it doesn't mean I'm interested in repeating the experience." I could hear something in his voice that I'd never heard before. Not anger or hurt, but complete indifference. Like I was a stranger who'd called the wrong number. "Are you happy?" I asked, because I needed to know whether his coldness was protecting him from pain or whether he'd actually moved on completely. "I'm content," Walter said. "I'm healthy, I'm financially stable, and I don't have to worry about being lied to or betrayed by the person I trust most. So yes, I'd say I'm happy." "What about forgiveness?" I asked. "What about the fact that people make mistakes and deserve second chances?" Walter was quiet for a long moment. "Rebecca, you didn't make a mistake. You made a series of deliberate choices over several weeks. You chose to have an affair. You chose to keep having unprotected sex with me after you knew you were infected. You chose to lie about it when I confronted you, and you chose to gaslight me into thinking it was somehow my fault. Those weren't mistakes. They were decisions. But I was trying to protect you," I said, even though I knew how weak it sounded. "You were protecting yourself," Walter said, "and you were willing to risk my health to do it. I can't build a relationship with someone who thinks that's acceptable." After that conversation, I stopped calling. It was clear that Walter had made up his mind about me and about our relationship, and nothing I could say was going to change that. He'd moved on, and I was supposed to do the same. The practical challenges of rebuilding my life were overwhelming. The legal judgments had wiped out most of my savings, and finding new employment in my field proved difficult. Once potential employers Googled my name and found the news coverage of the negligence lawsuit. I consulted with several lawyers about suing my former employer for wrongful termination, but they all told me the same thing, that my case had no merit given the circumstances of my dismissal. Jason had moved on too, apparently. I heard through mutual friends that he was dating someone new, someone who didn't come with legal drama and public humiliation. When I ran into him at a coffee shop near our old office, he was polite but distant, like we were acquaintances who'd worked together briefly, rather than people who'd had an intimate relationship. "How are you doing?" he asked, but in that way that made it clear he didn't really want a detailed answer. "I'm managing," I said. "It's been a difficult transition, but I'm working on getting back on my feet." Jason nodded sympathetically, but I could tell he was eager to end the conversation. "Well, take care of yourself," he said, and then he was gone. The loneliness was crushing. Walter had been my best friend as well as my husband, and losing both relationships at once left me feeling completely untethered. I'd sacrificed other friendships during the years when I was focused on caregiving and managing our household crises, and now I was paying the price for that isolation. Therapy helped to some extent. My counselor encouraged me to focus on taking responsibility for my choices and building a new life based on healthier patterns and better decision-making. She helped me understand that my resentment about the caregiving burden had been legitimate, but that my way of handling it had been destructive and ultimately self-defeating. "You felt unappreciated and overwhelmed," she said during one of our sessions. Those were valid feelings, but instead of addressing them directly with Walter, You chose to seek validation outside your marriage while simultaneously deceiving him about something that affected his health. Do you see how those choices made the original problems worse instead of better? I did see it, eventually, but understanding my mistakes intellectually didn't make the consequences any easier to live with. Walter was moving on with his life, taking things one day at a time, as he'd put it, while I was stuck dealing with the aftermath of choices I couldn't undo. Sometimes I wondered what would have happened if I'd just been honest from the beginning. If I'd told Walter I was feeling neglected and unappreciated. If I'd insisted on counseling, or made it clear that our relationship needed attention before I started looking elsewhere for validation. If I'd told him about the STI results immediately, instead of trying to manage the situation on my own. But those were hypothetical scenarios, and they didn't change the reality of where I was now. Walter had made it clear that he considered our divorce a victory, a successful escape from a relationship that had become toxic and dangerous for him. He had no regrets about cutting me out of his life completely, and he had no interest in forgiveness or reconciliation. I was the cautionary tale now, the woman who'd had a good marriage and destroyed it through selfishness and deception. The woman who'd prioritized her own immediate gratification over her husband's health and safety. The woman who'd lost everything because she couldn't figure out how to ask for what she needed without betraying the person she claimed to love most. Walter was right about one thing. I hadn't made a mistake. I'd made a series of deliberate choices, each one designed to protect myself from consequences while pushing those consequences onto him. And now I was living with the results of those choices, alone and struggling to build something new from the wreckage of everything I'd destroyed. The hardest part was accepting that this was permanent. That Walter wasn't going to change his mind or decide to give me another chance. That the life we'd built together was truly over, and that the ending was entirely my fault. I'd been so focused on what I deserved and what I needed that I'd forgotten about what Walter deserved. And now he was getting it, a life free from the chaos and betrayal I'd brought into his world. Some days I still wanted to call him, to try one more time to explain or apologize or find some way back to the connection we'd once had. But I knew it would be selfish and pointless. Walter had moved on, and the kindest thing I could do was let him stay moved on. He was happy now, or at least content, and he deserved that peace after everything I'd put him through. So I was learning to live with the consequences of my choices, one day at a time, just like Walter was learning to live with his freedom from me. The difference was that his days were getting better, while mine were just getting longer.